Leon, your first taste of theatre came while you were still in high school, I understand. Maybe earlier, I don't know. But from the 52 to 55 period, you worked with Robert Gill at Hart House in 6 productions, take my word for it. In what way would you say he influenced your career as a director?
Oh, totally. He was the first teacher I had in the theatre. He taught me the basic principles of the theatre. He taught me the techniques of directing and production, and there were 2 strong mentors in my life in terms of teaching me. One was Robert Gill, the other was Herman Geiger-Terrell, who was the artistic director of the Canadian Opera Company. And Gill gave me all the basic knowledge about the theatre in the Stanislavski tradition, which is what he was versed in. And to him I owe a great deal. He was not just a teacher, he was a mentor. And that's hard to come by.
How did Gill influence your career as an actor?
Well, I think he was very wise when he was very, very, very positive about my becoming a director and not an actor. The acting talent was somewhat limited, okay?
Could you sort of bring up a picture of what it was like to be part of the Hart House company? Like, for example, the rehearsal process?
Yeah, it was interesting because I went to Hart House in 52. I actually studied with him in 51 before I got to Hart House. And that was post-World War II, so that by the time I got there, people like Eric House, Kate Reed, the Davises had gone through Hart House, and they were the kind of leading theatre people, and that was wonderful. Then when I got there, there was a whole new group. Donald Sutherland was there at the time, and Gill treated us absolutely as if we were professionals. He brooked no amateur behavior. If you were late, he would be furious. If there was noise, he would scream. He was never abusive. He was never unkindly, and he was never crude. He treated his students as they were students, but as professional students. So that he would guide, he would explain, he would talk about acting, he would talk about the process of acting, he would talk about the technique of acting, and in the blocking process he would always give you reasons, and when you were insecure, when you asked questions, he would take the time to explain. So that he was he was committed. I mean, I once asked Gill why he didn't, after he was at Carnegie Mellon, and I once asked him why he didn't go to New York. Because he was a wonderful director. And he said he didn't want to enter that rat race. And he much preferred working with young people, and a wonderful theatre at the time Hart House was. And it was a perfect location for him. Whether he believed that later in his life, I don't know. But at that time, that's what he told me. And he was a great encourager and a stimulus for young people to go into the theatre, which didn't exist. I mean, there was no theatre to speak of in Toronto. I mean, when I announced at the age of 18 to my father I was going into the theatre, his first question to me was, "Where are you going to work?" And my answer was, "We're going to make our own." And it was an exciting time because we were all learning, and we had to plunge ahead and forge on our own. I think it's much tougher for young people now, much tougher for actors now than it was then.
The Hart House was connected with the university, right?
Hart House was part of the University of Toronto.
You were in high school, though, were you?
The year I went to Gill, 51, I was still in high school. Then in 52, I went to the university and was there then the 3 years.
And was Hart House in some way connected with the university life, or was it a kind of adrift, cut off?
Oh no! It was first of all, the University of Toronto at the time, I think still, do not have a professional theatre program. They did not feel, I think now looking at it rightly, that the university had no business in the training of actors, and it was all much more academic. So that the theatre was extracurricular, and it was open to all members of the university, all students of the university. There were, of course, those group of students who were determined to go into the theatre, and they became the nucleus at the time they were at school for the productions, etc. And I obviously became one of those funny people. And I remember my last year of university, I went to 9 classes over the entire year, because I spent all of it in the theatre, either with Robert Gill or doing a production here or doing a production there. So it was, I mean, it was the theatre centre in Toronto, except for the road shows that were coming in.
It wasn't a theatre per se, Hart House. It was a converted sport facility. Do you remember?
No. It was a theatre. It was a theatre. It had. I can't remember the number of seats, 400 or 450. A stage. It had a dressing room corridor. It had very little flying, but you could do some flying. No, it was a real theatre. It was kind of in the basement of Hart House itself, but it was real.
How do you react to the information I found that it had been a rifle gallery or something?
I react that it could possibly have been. Sure. I don't know. I don't know the history of Hart House in that theatre. Okay. I should, but I don't.
The early 60s, by the way, I found to be a very productive time in your career. You had the opportunity to work with Michael Langham at Stratford as
his assistant.
How did that come about? How did you land that gig?
I don't know. I did, in I guess 59 or 60, I did John Gray's new play at Hart House, and I don't know how I got that job. I cannot remember, and met Michael that year, and then doing that work. The Teacher, that was the play. The Teacher was with Michael Learned, was in that, who was at that time married to, I don't remember. Oh boy, am I old. And Michael and I talked during the time I was there, and he invited me back the following year as his assistant on Love's Labour's Lost and Coriolanus. That was the Paul Scofield Love's Labour with Zoe Caldwell, and John Kolakos was in Coriolanus, and so I went back and did that. Then the following year I came back to Stratford and did a production of the Gondoliers.
That was, I think, 62. You had curtains coming down in Vancouver and Stratford. That was something for you. Could you please describe what that felt like, what that meant to you?
Oh, it was phenomenal. I mean, I remember that. That was the Caesar and Cleopatra, which we done at the Crest, and then went to Vancouver, and then Stratford. And I mean, how old was I? I was, not even 30, and had shows playing on either, all over the. It was very heady, and it was. I mean, I remember being, my goodness, all these shows. It was terrific.
Okay, Gondoliers and Caesar and Cleopatra. That's correct. Were you directing one of them?
Both of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What were some of your biggest challenges while at Stratford, by the way?
Learning about Shakespeare and how to do Shakespeare. And Michael Langham is probably the best Shakespearean director in this country, or in the United States. His understanding of text, his ability to read a text and read the subtext of Shakespeare, his ability to get the actors to speak the verse with the rhythms that the text demands, and an understanding of the text, but with the emotional content underneath, is extremely perceptive. And watching Michael direct Scofield in Love's Labour, and watching him work with Scofield in Coriolanus, which was the one I had more to do with, was an object lesson that every young director should have had that experience. I mean, Michael was a really great director, and even at the time, when you're young and you're working with somebody, you think, well, and then later you realize how great he was. But even at that time, I realized how important a director and how incisive a director Langham was, and is.
Okay. Now, when you think about the Gondoliers, what memories come to mind?
Fun. so it's a wonderful piece. It was the first time I directed Douglas Campbell, who turned out to be a total joy to work with. We had opera singers in it. Dodi Protero, I think, was one of them, and Victor Braun was in there. And I remember we had a wonderful time extracting the jokes out of Gilbert and Sullivan. And I think it turned out to be, if I remember correctly, a good show. I don't remember the reviews, but certainly the cast and I had a great time.
You were assistant director then? You
On the Gondoliers? No, I directed the Gondoliers, yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Mentioning Douglas Campbell, what is it about him that permitted him such longevity on the stage in his career?
Oh my goodness! I think what allows every person who goes on in the theater for a long time to go on, I think that is their continuing curiosity, the continuing of an understanding that every time you do a part or every time you direct a play or an opera, it's a new experience. And the moment it becomes boring and old hat, that's the moment you lose your abilities. And I think Douglas entered every play. I mean, I haven't seen him for 10 years, I guess, but every play he directed or acted in, he approached with the same curiosity that he did as a young man. And I think that's what keeps everybody in the theater 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, however old we are. It's that curiosity and that understanding that no matter how many years experience you have, when you do another play or another opera or another musical, it's always the first time. I mean, you have experience and you can cut corners and you know how to do things faster, but the investigation is still new. And of course you have new experiences in your own life, which colors what you then do with the pieces.
Speaking of long careers, the Davis brothers,
Mm-hmm.
the Davis family involvement with the Crest, and the Straw Hat Players.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to know, specifically in the Ontario sphere, how important were they to the growth of the theatre in this province?
Well, looking back now, I think they were very important. The Straw Hat Players gave that whole first crop, that post-war crop of actors, the opportunity to become professionals. You're going to talk to Eric House, and he'll talk to you about that because he was part of that. I was just a little past that, but Kate and George Cowan, all those people entered the profession thanks to the Straw Hat Players and the Davises. When the Davises created the Crest Theatre, in retrospect, I think the error they made was basing it on the English system, the fortnightly rep system. Now, in fairness to them, that's the system they knew, so naturally they were going to do that. They received a lot of negative publicity, and in some cases that negative publicity was justified, but they also contributed a great deal to the development of the acting community and young directors. I mean, it was the Davises who gave me the opportunity to direct professionally in Toronto, as they did many others. So that I think their importance is the courage to start a brand new repertory theatre at the Crest on Mount Pleasant, north of St. Clair, in whenever it was. I mean, that was very courageous. And they allowed the theatre to take its first post-war professional steps. And I think that's an important contribution. And I think it's silly to, I mean, there isn't a theatre in the world that hasn't been harshly treated by some critic or other at some time. But and in this country, I think they made a very valuable contribution. I think they were too rigid in maintaining the system that they maintained. I think they were still too inclined to the English system, and they didn't push it over into the Canadian or even the American way, or find a way for our own country. But nevertheless, that doesn't dismiss the importance.
Clearly you had some kind of artistic dialogue. You may have had agreements and disagreements. You definitely worked together with the Davises and their system. but were you a bad boy in some way coming on the scene?
What does that mean? What does a bad boy mean?
Nathan Cohen and the way he often savaged the Crest. Would you perhaps go give it to him?
Well, listen, I'm a human being, and every once in a while people do things you think, oh, you stupid son of a bitch, you should get it really good. But when you look at it, I think you have to be really careful. I mean, I think Nathan was a great critic. I thought he was a really wonderful critic, and he turned out to be a good friend of mine despite his savagery of some of my shows. But he was really a man of great integrity. I think he was extremely harsh on the Crest, perhaps too harsh, and I think that was a clash of temperament, of cultural backgrounds, of all kinds of things. But I think we have to be very careful when something is beginning and needs nurturing. It doesn't mean that you pander to it, and I don't think it means that you stop praising it or stop panning it. But I think it has to be couched in language which does not discourage, not the public, does not discourage the profession, which is very, very fragile, or was. I mean, and it still is.
You were resident director of the Crest 61-62? I'm telling you this, is that right?
Yes. Yeah, oh no, I think that's right. I think that's right.
And what were some of the challenges you faced there, given what you said?
Well, in '57, I went to Europe and got a Canada Council grant, and I stayed in Europe until '59 and saw hundreds of plays. I traveled all through the British Isles, into Ireland, London. I went to France. I went to the Berliner Ensemble. I was in Berlin before the wall was up. And I went to Austria, to Italy. I saw a lot of theater and began to formulate in my own mind what kind of theater we should have in this country. I was a committed nationalist. I believed passionately in the theater in this country and how we should develop our own. So when I came back from Europe in '59, I was asked to adjudicate the Dominion Drama Festival, which I did in the East, and went to Halifax and St. John's, Newfoundland, and I think it was Fredericton in New Brunswick. And in Halifax, I met some of the people and talked about a professional theater. Well, when I came back from there, I'd formulated in my head what a theater should be, the ideal theater, and how it should work in this country. It was quite opposite to the Crest, right? So one of the problems I had as resident director was dealing with the philosophic concept that the Davises had and my own philosophic concept, and that kind of clash. At the same time, and this is pragmatic, you have to earn a living, you have to work. So you give up, if you're going to work for somebody and they're going to pay you, you better think about how they want to do it, because you can't go and attack your bosses. I think it's really stupid. So it was an internal problem that I had. And the limitations of that theater physically, the budget limitations, which meant what you could do and what you couldn't do. And at the same time, the Davises gave me Long Day's Journey into Night with Gwen Franken Davies. Not many young directors got to direct Gwen Franken Davies in Long Day's Journey into Night, one of the great plays of the American theater. So there is that part of it. So that you get always the conflicts internally, and at the same time, these golden opportunities. That was the performance, Long Day's Journey into Night, with David Hooks, James Douglas, Gwen Franken Davies, and George Luscombe. And the opening night of that, the house went to dark, the lights came up on stage, and the first maybe 5 speeches were uttered, and everything went blackout. That was a blackout in Toronto, and the audience had to wait 45 minutes for the lights to come on, and Long Day's Journey is a 3-hour play. Nobody left. It was quite a wonderful experience. And I remember because Gwen Franken Davies was practically blind, and in rehearsal she would constantly trip over furniture. And, you know, she was in her 70s then. Everyone would rush up and try and help her, and she said, "Oh dear boy, I do it all the time. I'll just fall. Don't worry about it." It was extraordinary. So I mean, there were the Davises giving a young director that opportunity, and at the same time, this young director saying, "This isn't right. It's not right." So they were conflicting times, and budget, continual problem.
Clearly an alliance there, because you had some ideas and they had the physical space and the opportunity to hand out. You've obviously touched on this already, your role of developing a different kind of Canadian national theatre for the Canada Council. You said you took a grant. What did you produce? Did you have a report? Can you tell me what was, if you could sum it up, like the lead graph, the thesis statement of that?
Sure, it was that I believed at the time, I don't know if I still believe it, I think I still believe it, that the national theatre of this country is not a specific building in a specific city, but a chain of theatres across the country, which could both exchange productions and could share new plays together and become a voice much like the CBC, but in the live theatre. I believed passionately in the repertory system, where you would have 3 or 4 plays in repertory alternating each night. I believed passionately in the company, that you had a company of actors who did those plays, some large parts, some small parts, with guest actors, and that every actor should have a contract for 52 weeks with holidays, just like every other worker in the country, and that they should be assured of that so they could concentrate on their craft and on the development of the art of the theatre. And I believed that passionately, and that's what I wrote to the Canada Council, and it was Peter Dwyer, who was then head of the council, who called and said, "This is very interesting, what you've done." This was based on the European system, and I said, let's take a city like Halifax, because of the conversations that I'd had in Halifax '59. And Peter Dwyer then said, Tom Patterson, who had founded the Stratford Festival, sent Tom and I off to Halifax to talk, and gave us money to go and talk to people and develop it. And in fact, that's the birth of Neptune. Arthur Murphy was the dominant force there, as was Laird Fearn, and they wanted a theatre for whatever reasons they had. I wanted a theatre there for a lot of reasons. One, it was the East Coast. It was the beginning of a chain of theatres that could happen. Hirsch was already in Winnipeg developing that. A man named Michael Johnson at the time was trying to start the Vancouver Playhouse. So there were 3 theatres now, and then there was the theatre in Toronto developing. And that was one reason. The second reason, how many directors get the opportunity to have their own theatre and do what they want and put into effect what they believe should be. Another motivation. And the other dominant idea was that the community seemed to want a theatre. Now, the feasibility study said the opposite. But you can interpret feasibility studies any way you want, right? We interpreted to say, of course they want a theatre. And we set about doing that. And Murphy and Laird Fearn and other members of the board were, I mean, talk about courage. Start a theatre in a 225,000 a city, 225,000 population in that small city, whose history of the theatre was from Newfoundland, from the New London Players, I think they were called, who were a group from England who came and toured the East, based themselves in St. John's. I'm not sure if that's right, but I know there was a touring company. They had a thriving amateur theatre and not a lot of professional theatre. So that board was extremely courageous in saying, let's go and build this theatre. And so when the council, when Peter Dwyer, who was a remarkable man, had the vision to do that, and the Canada Council gave its imprimatur on Neptune, it was a vote of confidence for the citizens of Halifax and for that board, and they plunged in. But I think, I mean, even to this day, I'm amazed at their courage. And then what amazed me even more is the courage of the actors. There's in that Neptune storybook, David Renton talks about, when I asked him to come, he said, "Where the hell is Halifax? What's Halifax?" Well, can you imagine going to an actor and saying, "We want you to come for 52 weeks to Halifax"? I mean, Halifax in 1963? But Don Greenhalgh, Ted Follows, Bernard Behrens, Deborah Cass, George Sperdakis, David Renton, Gary Crawford, Diane LeBlanc, all of these people had the vision and the courage to say, yes, what an adventure. And it was the first theater in the country to sign actors on a 52-week contract, guaranteed holidays. And they came, and the community of actors rolled into Halifax. I mean, I think that's, looking back on it now, very, very brave. And my wife and I, at that time, we had 2 children, and off we went and rented a house, and other actors came and rented houses, and we became the family. And Ron Hastings was in that. I mean, it was amazing. And we started. Mavra Moore came the first season. George McCowan came the first season. And we started to make this this little theater called Neptune.
Since I'm jumping ahead, and I'm pleased about it because of the sequence you're talking about things, but I've found strange opposites here, in that the community did seem to warm to the theater. However, you also had some community antipathy to, in the name of a publisher.
Well, it was amusing. I don't think there's anything that's ever white or anything that's ever black. And I think there are constantly conflicts and contradictions, and everybody's life is filled with contradictions, mine certainly included. But I remember when Tom Patterson and I think it was Tom and I, went to the publisher, the newspaper publisher, and we talked about founding this theater and having this, and he said, "What do you want a theater here for? People want theater, they can go to New York or London." And the answer, we said, "Well, what about the people who can't afford to go to New York or London?" And his answer was, "Well, they don't deserve the theater anyway." I mean, talk about snobism. Well, that's enough to stimulate anybody to saying, "Well, screw you, Charlie, we're going to make a theater here." And I encountered, Halifax it's a wonderful city. And in fact, I have a daughter who went to the Nova Scotia College of Art in the early 90s, late 80s. She went back there. But it's a city of contrasts. I mean, there is anti-Upper Canadianism, there was discrimination, there was anti-Semitism, there was, it got very vicious at times. I mean, board meetings sometimes were volatile. And at the age of 30, when you're idealistic, as I was, I hope still am to some extent, and you have passion about what you're doing, there were many times in board meetings you'd say, "Well, you either do this or I'll resign," which is not mature behavior. But you do that in order to keep going. And there were a few volatile board meetings where that happened. And there were hostilities. People would resign because they didn't. I remember at one board meeting, a man said, "I don't want a foreign Upper Canadian telling us what to do here in Nova Scotia." I mean, that's pretty damaging. That was quite a volatile board meeting. So there were lots of things, and then there were the good things where as every year we were in budget conflict and crisis, because it was always budget crisis. And at a board meeting, somebody said, "Well, we have to fire the staff, or fire some staff." And I was saying, "You can't fire staff. You fire staff, you're cutting your own throat. Who does the work?" And a retired admiral who was then absolutely as right can be.
So, anytime you guys ready.
Super. You mentioning, I'm guessing, is it Colonel Oland?
Colonel Olin was the man who Arthur Murphy went to buy the theater on the condition that Neptune Foundation would pay the mortgage. And Olin agreed, and that's how the physical building came about. Yeah.
Miss Gregson, in a quote, said she visited the site under construction and marveled in some anticipation. Can you tell me a little bit about these months when it was established you were getting a theater, but you still had to open the thing?
Yes. Joan Gregson was a local actress who we invited to come into the company. And I guess I went to Halifax in the spring, March or April, and we were going to open later. And the building was a movie theater, and I think when we took it over, it was a kind of quasi-porno movie theater. It was filthy. And Laird Fairn, who was an original member of the board, was an architect. And his firm undertook to do the renovation under the supervision of Les Lawrence. Les Lawrence was a Toronto designer at the time, and he designed the theater. And the theater was totally gutted. All the old seats were removed, the walls were stripped back, the garbage was shoveled out. I mean, I cannot tell you what we found in there. I don't want to tell you what we found in there. The dressing rooms backstage underneath had to be excavated to put dressing rooms in, and all of that. And it was a very small theater. It turned out to be 525 seats. With a small stage, I think the opening was 26 feet across and not much depth, maybe 30 feet if that. We had a little apron and 2 boxes on the side, had a balcony, and it had full flies but no wing space. And we had to build something behind it for storage. And it turned out to be a real gem. I mean, a really beautiful little theater. And we did, in that space, sometimes we had 4 plays in repertory. We would fly them and take them out and strip them, and it was insane. It was total madness to try and do that kind of work. But passionate were our beliefs in this kind of system, that everybody worked to do it. You know, and the 2 first carpenters, brothers, John and Jack and William Blackmore, were, I think, the bedrock of Neptune. They were phenomenal.
Was it just the historical period, or would you still say that a theater could be or should be allowed to run into a debt and challenge its budgets?
That's a philosophic question. Because it depends totally on the kind of system, culture, and society. I'm of 2 minds. One part of me says theaters should be able to succeed without subsidy. But I think when you look at the history of the theater, it never happens. And one part of me says, no, every theater should have subsidy. And in the end, if you push me to the wall, I would say every theater needs a subsidy. And the subsidy is not for the theater, the subsidy is for the audience, so that the ticket prices are kept down. You know, I think the theater, as much as it has to commit itself to popular culture and pop music, pop shows, I think also has a responsibility to develop beyond that. And theaters in a place like Neptune, in like Halifax, have to do a lot of things. I mean, they have to play Shakespeare and the Greeks, and they have to play the contemporary plays. They're like a library. They have to cover the gamut. When you come to a city like Toronto or New York or Vancouver, where you can have many theaters because of the population, somebody can do Shakespeare, somebody can do new work, somebody can do musicals. I mean, it gets distributed a little more. But in a city like Neptune, Halifax, or Winnipeg, or Regina, I think that theaters have a great responsibility, and that takes a lot of money. I mean, actors need to be paid, and they need to be paid well, and stagehands need to be paid, and people need to earn a decent living and a decent salary. And if you charge $150 a ticket, who's going to come? So I think you need to have that kind of subsidy, and I think it's a terrible mistake not to have it. I worry about total subsidy. I'm not sure that any theater should be totally subsidized by the government or a single foundation. And the mixed economy of private fundraising, box office, and government subsidization, I think, is a very good way of doing it. The United States has very little government subsidy, and what little may be gone soon. I'm not sure that's a good thing.
In as much as it was subsidized, you still had a market-driven angle. You wanted to see those seats full, and in many cases you did, in many cases you didn't. Say for the Fantastics, there was a run that was a surprise, that it didn't do better.
Staggered me. I can't explain it. Snowstorm on the opening for 1 week. It was terrible. People couldn't get out to go to the theater. Maybe the momentum died. I don't know. I can't. I mean, I wish I could. I cannot explain why something is a success and something's not. We did a production called The Wooden World, which was a compilation of poetry and prose writing and historical viewpoints about the founding of Halifax. It was done with 6 actors in a set like a living room, and they read a lot of it. And it was put together by a man named John Douglas, who was the dramaturge at Neptune at the time. And we scheduled it for 3 performances. Well, you couldn't buy a ticket for it, so we put it into the season next year, and it did incredibly well. Who would have expected a look at the history of Nova Scotia and Halifax, as told by Hugh McClellan and other writers, read by actors, to be a success? And yet it was a phenomenal success, and one of the great prides for me in Neptune. Whereas the Fantastics, which was a popular show, well done, good singing, wonderfully funny, didn't do well. You explain it. I can't.
July 1st, 1963, opening night. Can you tell me about it?
Yes, I was quite drunk. I was really, I had some champagne, I had some wine. It was a phenomenal evening. I mean, you can imagine at the age of 30, you suddenly opened a theatre in the country supported by the Canada Council, by a group of citizens in Halifax, in a building that's all been renovated, with actors and directors and designers that you have chosen. And it's opened, and there's a lot of people coming in this, and everybody is saying congratulations. My goodness. And one glass of champagne, and the head was spinning. And it was a very exciting night. We thought, this is it, we're away. The letdown came the following week.
That first show was...
Major Barbara.
Could you explain a little bit in a thumbnail that... wasn't it the Roi Neptune?
I'm sorry?
The Roi Neptune? The French...
the name. That was... The name came from a priest named Marc Lescarbot, who came to America in early 1600s, and to occupy the mission and the people, members of the mission, over the winter, they prepared a play called The Theatre of Neptune. And in the spring, they performed it on the water, in canoes and on the shore. And it was, I think it was his way of keeping people occupied through the long, hard winters of Nova Scotia. And so the name came from that original production, we'll call it Neptune Theatre, after Marc Lescarbot's Theatre of Neptune. It's very old.
First play, I think, written in North America.
Yes.
Certainly in French North America.
Yeah.
For some reason, I sent to me in my research that you used a great deal of green paint for a backstage area. What's all that about?
I don't remember.
Knowing that you were having people there all year, did you make these players were there all year and were basically living there as you would for like 6 years or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
How was it? How was the accommodations day after day? Was it cramped, uncomfortable? Time?
In the theater?
Yeah.
Oh, the theater was very small, and we tried to do it. For example, little things in the dressing rooms, which had to be shared. We tried to make sure that every actor had his or her own drawer with a key, so they could have their personal stuff there. We had a large green room where actors could come and sit and talk, because the dressing rooms were very small. And it was cramped and confined, but that was less important than the idealism that pervaded through the whole building and the entire acting community of Neptune. So people got, of course there were fights and arguments and jealousies and egos and all of that, but that's a given. But it was so idealistic from the actor's point of view and from the board's point of view that you overcame a lot of things that we wouldn't overcome after 10 years in the theater. You think, oh, come on, but at that time we wanted to make it work. It was important for the country, not just Halifax.
There's a family kind of feel. In fact, there's a quote that you were seen as a firm but kindly father. Do you see that for your original company? I think it was 14 or so. Was that the case?
I can't answer that. I mean, I don't know how I would view myself then. I viewed myself then as a good portion of the time quite scared, quite frightened because of the budgets, because of how to do it. I mean, I'd never run a company before. I was learning on the spot. And I knew about the theater. I knew what we had to do. I knew how to rehearse. I knew how to put a play on the stage. But learning how to run a company was coming on the job. So I was fearful and scared and bluffing and sometimes making terrible errors and sometimes hitting it right. But I knew exactly what the acting company should be. How they viewed me, you could only ask them. But my memories and what are real they're very different.
In that 25th anniversary book, there are all kinds of anecdotes and stories. The marriage of Mary Mcmurray, David Piggott. You recall this?
Oh, very well.
Can you tell me using their names about that?
Mary Mcmurray was a singer, and she was doing a production of Rigoletto in Toronto that I had directed, and she was vocally a fantastic voice. She had really beautiful voice, but she was having physical vocal difficulties, and she had talked about abandoning singing. I invited her to come to Neptune as an actress, which she did. And in that process, David Piggott was a professor of English at the university, and I guess he liked the theater, and he had friends who were in the theater. He met Mary, and love took over, and they got married and had 2 children and lived happily ever after. Mary is still in Halifax, as is David, and that's one of many marriages, in fact, at Neptune. There was a marriage. I can't remember the names. They had a marriage.
You can come back to that then if you want to try and remember the names.
Yeah.
I understand that the Piggott McMurray wedding, after there was a colourful performance the cast put on after enjoying a great deal of drink at the wedding reception.
Yes. It was not as accurate and as disciplined as it should have been.
Can we stop tape for a moment, please?
Sure.
Sorry, I gotta get a code out of here.
Oh, thanks for that. Thanks.
In 5, 4, 3, 2.
In the Glass Menagerie, I have that George Sperdakis made an unscheduled exit in the middle of it. Does that ring a bell?
No.
Okay.
I don't think I remember any of the disasters. I want you to understand that.
Some of your most memorable moments were with Canadian plays. Why? Did that fit in with your idealism?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Arthur Murphy, who was a surgeon in Halifax and one of the strong developers of Neptune, and was the first president of the board, was writing scripts for the Ben Casey medical series in Hollywood. And he was a playwright. And after we established Neptune, and after a couple of years, he resigned as president, and then felt ethically he could say, "Here is my play, would you like to do it?" And in fact, we did. It was a play called The Sleeping Bag, which we toured in 1967. And he wrote another couple, but we believed strongly in trying to develop new plays and new writers. We didn't always succeed. We did John Gray's Louisburg, to the development of that, and we did a play called John A. Beats the Devil. We did The Sleeping Bag, we did The Wooden World, did a couple of others. But none of them were strong enough, I think, to go into the future repertory, although the motives at the time were absolutely pure, and the attempts were pure, and like many plays, you try some, they don't succeed, and you go on to the next. But we all wanted to do new works, in fact.
The Sleeping Bag, speaking of it, Joan Gregson, David Renton, you toured with it, 1967. This is centennial year. We're talking about Canadian plays. Obviously, there's a certain significance there.
We were invited to do a tour for centennial year, and I felt that if we were going to tour, we should really take a play that we had developed in our company, which was Canadian. I mean, it was the 100th anniversary of the country, and I felt really strongly that we had to have a Canadian play. And that was the one we had done. It was done with great success, and so we decided to take that and Juno and the Peacock, both of which would show off the members of the company. Juno, I think I directed that, and I don't think I did it very well. I mean, I didn't really have an innate understanding of the rhythms of the play or the inner life of the play. Although the company in it, Maureen Fitzgerald and Rolly Hugo were in that, they understood it, and they were very good. But I think from a directorial point of view, it was not very successful. Whereas The Sleeping Bag, which I understood much better, I think from direction was better show.
In Swift Current, Saskatchewan, you say you don't remember the disaster, so I'll just try this one on you. Do you remember Winter Storm, when you rescued a woman and her son?
Vaguely, but I can't be specific.
You played The Sleeping Bag at Expo 67 in Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you play? Was it outdoor, indoor?
It was indoors. It was at the, I think, Théâtre du Maisonneuve, the small theater at is that right?
Sorry, it's at Place des Arts.
Yeah, Place des Arts. And yeah, that's where we played it. Yeah, I don't think it was a big box office success. I don't remember.
Do you remember your time in Montreal or the time at Expo 67? Was it there a culmination of anything cultural that was happening there?
Oh, personally, it was wonderful. I mean, I remember vividly the Czech Pavilion, which was unique, you know, with the screens and the slide techniques and all of that. That was fabulous. I remember being very, heady for the country, for me as part of the country, for Neptune. We were flying high. 100th anniversary, theater supported by the state, actors that were our own new play, a world celebration in Montreal, in Canada. It was wonderful. And I remember it with great fun. I was there twice that year, once with Louis Riel, which I directed here. So I was there in the spring and in the fall, and it was really an exciting time. And again, I mean, we were all young and had that energy and vibrancy and cared passionately about what happened.
Riel, I know that you worked with Langham, who had handpicked a lot of francophones for Stratford. In Riel, did you work with French-speaking actors?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little about the French-speaking actors you worked with?
Well, the lead was Bernard Terjon, who was a French singer, who totally bilingual. Paul Trepanier, I don't know if he was in the first production of Riel or the second, I don't remember. But there were half a dozen. André Lortie was from Montreal, was that. And that was, the Riel was again an experience that was most satisfying because the French singer and the English singer came together to produce a work that was totally Canadian. It was totally ours. Louis Riel, patriot or villain, however you look upon him, but he was ours. It was a story that was rooted in Canada. And the two, in the most idealistic of way, the two cultures came together to present that piece. And that was very satisfying. And I mean, again, there was Herman Geiger Terrell, the Canadian Opera Company director, who commissioned it. He did it with the Chalmers Foundation, but he had the courage to do this extraordinary new opera with French singers and English singers together in the O'Keefe Center, 3,200 seats. It took a lot of guts. And at the same time, he did two new operas in that season. He did The Luck of Ginger Coffee, written by Ray Pennell, side by side. I mean, that's courage. And I think well-placed courage, not stupid courage.
Getting back to Neptune briefly here, you toured a bit in the Maritimes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever go to Newfoundland?
Not in my time. It was just.
Tell me about what you did tour. You did tour.
We toured New Brunswick. We toured the Annapolis Valley. We tried to. We went to Truro. I remember. We tried as part of the mandate of Neptune. It wasn't just a Halifax theatre. We thought it should be a theatre for Nova Scotia. So we tried to extend it into the communities of Nova Scotia, so it became a part of the province. We went to Prince Edward Island. We went there with Sir John Beats the Devil. And I think it's still important that Neptune is not just in Halifax, that it's part of the whole. I mean, you can't have a theatre in Truro. It just won't happen because there's not enough. So everything that Neptune does should go to Truro or to the Valley or to Sydney or to wherever.
How did the troupe get around?
Bus, car.
And the budgets to be put up in your host cities, were they there?
Yes, the budgets came from the host city or representatives in the host city, and some from the government, some from the Canada Council, and some from the Neptune budgeting.
I don't mind getting back to the wooden world for a moment. I read somewhere that you were shocked that even a hardened critic like Nathan Cohen was moved by what he called the potent emotional impact of this richly edited collage, the wooden world. So it wasn't just the people that wanted it, but so the critics also recognized it. Could you go a little more elaborate into exactly what was it people seemed to respond to about that?
I think it presented to that public their own past. You know, the big Halifax explosion is still present in or was then present. You know, the houses that went up temporarily after are still there. So I think it was the presence of the past in their daily lives and the presentation of that past in the most sympathetic of ways which struck their heart. It was very, very moving. When the company read Hugh McClellan's description of the explosion, everyone cried. not because it was done sentimentally, but because it was only, 40 years before that. So there were people there who remembered the explosion. And I think it touched them in a very real way, because it was about them and it was about their community. And it was very, very honest. It was not affected. It was not overproduced. It was not decorated with dance and all that frou-frou. It was an absolutely direct telling of the history of Nova Scotia, the rock, the wooden world on the rock. And it was docu-theater in the most living of ways, where the actors in that were so good because they each played the character they were reading, and they played them with a great deal of passion and energy and simplicity. And I think that's why it worked.
Speaking of why it worked, or why did the Neptune succeed in becoming the first year-round Canadian theatre? Why did it actually fly?
Willpower. Pure will. When you're 30 years old at that time, and money is a secondary consequence to the idealism, you can be very, very strong. And I was determined it was going to be a repertory theater all year, so that actors could have a night off. And we kept it going for about 2.5 years, and then we had to modify it, and then eventually it went into stock. But it was sheer willpower. And I still believe it. I still believe that's what it should be.
Nonetheless, it was a sort of first for Canada, so there must have been an element of apprenticing people into the first professional year-round theatre here.
Mm-hmm.
So was there also an element of how do you say, just getting by blindly, not knowing how something is done?
It was learning on the job. I mean, we had no idea how it would work. And at the end of the first year, we knew what the problems were, and we could then adjust to accommodate the problems. But it was learning on the job. And what the experience that I had gained personally in Europe, looking at the repertory theaters in Europe, and particularly in Germany and in France, and how they were operated. And at that time, I was a committed Brechtian. I mean, I loved Bertolt Brecht, and I don't think we did any in Halifax. The stages, we didn't have the company, the size that we needed, but his whole social view was appealed to me a great deal. And in fact, when I came to the St. Lawrence, we did 5 or 6 Brecht shows. And so that idealism kept going too, in terms of the repertory system. But it was sheer willpower.
Rusted hulks, and most of it's torn down. The Buckminster Fuller American Pavilion, all the plastic burned out one day about 15 years ago.
Already.
But it's still up there.
I'm rolling.
Still now we're rolling it.
You don't want me to hold the white paper?
No.
Okay. What did Mavor Moore add to the Neptune? And using his name again, sort of that.
In the first season, I thought it would be important to have eminent Canadian figures in Halifax to, one, give the stamp of approval to it, and to maintain a certain standard, to keep quality, and to give it a kind of class. Mavor Moore was is a strong figure in the theatre in Canada, and was at the time a leading actor, director, writer. Everybody knew Mavor Moore. And so, and he was a very good actor. And so when we started casting about what should the first show be, because we didn't have time to commission a new one, nor did we know enough to commission a new one, I tried to find a piece that would be entertaining, but have substance, that would give the acting company a chance to show off, And when we came to Major Barbara, what a great part for Mavor Moore, the role of Undershaft. What a great part for Dawn Greenhalgh to play Major Barbara. So we decided on Major Barbara, and I invited Mavor to do that, which he agreed to do. And I think he brought a great deal of class and standard and quality to the theatre by his presence there. And the board were delighted, because it was an eminent Canadian figure which said, it's okay, this theatre is kosher, right? And then he stayed for the summer and he directed a piece, and then he went on from there to take over the Charlottetown Festival. So that's what Mavor Moore did, and I'm ever grateful. George McCowan directed it, and George was a very eminent television director, and I didn't want to do the opening show because I knew we'd have so many problems getting the theatre open that I thought I'd better stay away from it, and invited George to do that, which he did and did very well. And you know that it did have wonderful parts for the company, and that's the reason Mavor was there. And he brought class. He brought stuff to the theatre.
Actors of the caliber of Follows were there, even in the early days. You remember Ted?
Very well.
Can you
Oh, very well.
tell me a bit about him and his time there? How he came to work with you?
Well, when the board established the Neptune Foundation and engaged me as the first artistic director, founding artistic director, I said to the board, the moment I sign the contract, I am going out to hire 14 or 15 actors. Now, you understand that. And they all said they did. And in fact, they did. I signed the contract, came back to Toronto, and started to figure out who should come to this first company. Ted Follows and Dawn Greenhalgh, who were married at the time, were young, gifted, energetic actors, different kind of actor, each of them. So they were obvious, because Dawn could play parts like Major Barbara. She could also play parts like Mary Mary. Ted was a slick and polished performer who could do all kinds of things and very versatile. So they were naturals. They came, and they had 2 children at the time. So, I mean, think about that. Leaving Toronto, the center of the world, where all television production was, where you could make your living in television, to go to Halifax for, I don't remember, I think it was $15,000 a year, 12. I don't remember the salaries. I'd have to really look back. But they came partially because it was steady work, 2 children, partially because they knew they'd get to play wonderful parts, partially because of an adventure, and actors are by nature nomads, or were, and partially because I enjoyed working with them and they with me. So, and when they came, they were wonderful. They contributed to the theatre out of the rehearsal hours. Ted directed some. Dawn played small parts. And they were very enthusiastic boosters of Halifax. And when they entered the community, they not just entered the theatre community, they entered the whole community. Norman Welsh, actor from England who would become a Canadian citizen, he came to Neptune because it was an idealism. George Spadakis, who is probably the most idealistic of all of them, believed passionately in the company and how to do it, and he could barely wait to sign the contract. Bernard Behrens and Deborah Cass, his wife, I'd worked with at Stratford and had incredible admiration for both their talents. And they were naturals, because again, versatile. They could do many things. Bunny did a Desire Under the Elms that to this day is vivid in my memory, a performance that was truly unique. A great performance, should have been seen all over the world. I mean, it was an international performance. Deborah did the mute in the Fantastics, and it was exquisite. So so I tried to get actors who were versatile, who had idealism, and whose egos, which actors' egos are big, and so they should be, but who could at times sublimate their egos to the greater good. And all of those actors in that first company did that.
How did Joan help? Joan
Gregson?
Did it help in the success of the theatre? You said there's a local angle there.
Sure. Again, if you're going to go into a community to build a theatre, you better see what talent is in that community. Joan Gregson, David Brown, David Murray, Ed Rubin were young actors, amateur actors that were good. So they auditioned and we invited them in, and they came in as professionals. They weren't second-rate citizens. Joan Gregson and Bunny Behrens played the four posters. Only two people in that show. So she was given a major role first season. David Murray was a radio announcer and did all opera broadcasts. And he was a wonderful performer, not a leading performer, did cameo roles and did them well. Ed Rubin called himself the cameo player, because again, he did small parts, but he did them well. And as the years went on, you could see them growing with their knowledge and experience. And you're living in a community, you cannot ignore the community. And anybody who does so at their peril. And you can't patronize, and you cannot condescend. And these actors came into this company. David Brown came into this company he was a lawyer. And he is now in Toronto. I don't know if he's still acting, but they were professionals. And they mixed with the company from Toronto, and one of them still lives, David Renton still lives in Halifax. So I think that kind of mix became important.
In 1962, it was said, Major is sometimes violently demonstrative, but his personal prop, a stubby cigar, stays in place. What does that mean to you? Was that a caricature?
I have no idea what that means.
That was a press, I guess, the press either exaggeration or a caricature of you then. Were they out to get you? Did they like you? Did they try and figure you, pigeonhole you?
Oh, I think the critics in Halifax and in Toronto who came, and in Montreal who came, I think some wanted to be kind and make it work, and I think some were absolutely vicious and out to get me. I think all of us are paranoid in the theatre. We all have paranoia, and we think a bad review means it's they're out to get you. And I think in some cases the paranoia was justified. I think in many cases Nathan Cohen's reviews, which I sometimes would react to with absolute violence at home, I would just say, scream, how could he write that? And then a month later I would reread the review and he was absolutely right. You know, I think as the theatre grew, I think the critics have grown. I mean, the critics at the time, except for Nathan and maybe Herbie Whittaker, had no experience in the theatre. So how the hell could they write about the theatre? They knew nothing about it. And that was where it got irritating. And what got angry was the people who knew, who criticized, because you knew in the end that they were right. A lot of the time, not all the time. But I think my years at the St. Lawrence were much more abusive than the years at Neptune.
It's great that you mentioned Whittaker, and indeed he did have considerable depth in directing, acting even possibly. He used to write in Montreal, and he came down to Toronto to the Globe for many years. Did you get any attention from him? Even outside of Neptune, Stratford, what are your memories of Herbert Whittaker? Using his name.
Yeah, Herbert Whittaker was probably the critic who boosted the theatre more than anybody else in the country. He was a true, passionate lover of the theatre and would go out of his way to boost and support young artists, young theatre people. And he did it in a most healthy way. He didn't come to Neptune often. I think the paper wouldn't let him. But when he did, it was always, he would also always make the evaluation within the context of the theatre and its place in the province. And I think that's important in a young, growing theatre, and that you can't just say da-dum bad. You have to put it in context of how old is it, where is it, how is it working, what is it trying to do, is it coming close to what it's trying to do. And Herbie did that, and to some extent Nathan did that. Nathan was a harsher judge. His standards were different than Whitaker's, and he could be quite abusive, Nathan, in a most literary way. He couched his criticism very, very, very superbly.
Yeah, I've got another quote here that may or may not mean anything to you. If things aren't going well, Major will deliberately single out some routine bit of business by a bit player and make exorbitant huzzas about it. This fires up all the bit players with a sense of creative importance and gets the leading players into a contagion of invention. Does this sound like the right physic to you?
Mm-hmm.
Can you sort of describe a little bit how it might work? Not necessarily with any names, but how you can get the infection going, how you did succeed in doing that kind of thing.
What is a director's job? It's to put a play on the stage with a point of view that allows the actors their own creative growth, keeping the integrity of the play and the point of view taken. So aside from physically putting the play on the stage, blocking it, and physically taking a point of view saying Hamlet is about indecision, let us say, once those decisions are made and explained to the actors, I think it becomes the director's job to make an atmosphere in the rehearsal room where actors are free to invent and create. So that the actor in rehearsal can try things, fail, change it, and go on, where nobody is commenting or judging on the failure or the attempt. And I strongly think that a play or an opera is as strong as its weakest performer. And if you have one bad performance, it can shift the balance of the piece, or one bad performance can put a scene off so that it takes a while for the next scenes to recover, which shifts the balance. Small part, I mean, Stanislavski said there are no small parts, only small actors, and you know, that's a nice epigram, but who really believes it, right? But if you have a player who has one scene, and if that player can make that scene really inventive, it will have an effect on the other actors, including the leading actors. Equally, if the leading actor is inventive in the scene with the smaller part, it can infect the smaller part. So I think the importance of grabbing and making the surrounding players vital to the production by encouraging and developing their own invention is only benefits the whole play. And I still believe that, and I still work that way. That when in opera particularly, where you have choruses, where if you can see somebody in a chorus create something and you can grab hold of that and develop that, it's going to affect everybody in the chorus because they suddenly realize they have some importance, that they're not just window decoration. And I think that's important.
Can you recall a particular incident, and not necessarily from Neptune again, might have been Stratford, but still in this early period which reflects this kind of encouragement of a symbiosis? Was there one particular play that sticks out? Maybe you came to it as a doctor to fix the scene or the situation, and it worked.
Oh my goodness, yes. In Coriolanus in Stratford, Michael gave me the responsibility of staging one of the revolution scenes in the Senate chamber. And I had the job of taking these actors and making this revolution. And there were a couple of actors who were quite timid. And I remember working with them my memory is correct, in which they could do some action which stimulated the revolution, or the revolutionary feeling, which then affected other people. And that made the scene very, very rich. The fabric of that scene became quite rich. That was one case. There's a lot of examples of that in the opera work that I've done, where there are so many small parts and so many choruses, you can certainly grab young singers to develop.
Vancouver International Festival, Caesar and Cleopatra, first impressions.
A feeling at the time of being part of an important festival and being very honored to have been asked to go to that festival with that play. And that was done here with Mavor Moore, Toby Robbins, Francis Hyland, Bernard Barons. What a memory. And then I think when we went to Vancouver, Toby Robbins couldn't go, and Toby Weinberg, I think, took over. Is that right? Well, we'd have to look that. I mean, I don't know. And then we went there, and it was exciting in Vancouver. I mean, that was Goldschmidt's Vancouver International Festival. And I was very flattered and very honored that production was chosen to go there.
What was the theatrical scene there in Vancouver, if you remember 1962? What did you come to? What did you see there? What did you see before you...
I don't remember Vancouver in '62. I remember it as being overwhelmed by the mountains. I didn't enjoy the mountains a lot. They were very big. But there was a lot of theater going on. It was just starting, a lot of theater starting. But I wasn't there long enough to really get involved in it.
Did you ever work in Newfoundland at all?
No, no. Just as the adjudicator in '59.
Okay. I have just a few names. Maybe this will work with you. Click. Often we've been throwing out names, and we usually kind of getting, oh, nice performer, very professional. Just wondering if any of these, you get an actual, something you want to tell us on camera. Michael Bates starred against Alec Guinness at one point. Did you work with him?
No.
Irene Worth?
No.
Cecil Clark?
No.
Ray Diffin, wardrobe head at Stratford?
I didn't work with him. I know him.
Lauren Green? Did you work with him?
No, I knew Lauren Green. They were just a little ahead of me.
Donald Harris?
See, they're people older than me.
Yes.
Worked with Donald a lot. Brilliant mind, great wit, and very inventive.
Tanya Mozevich?
Oh, the designer of Stratford. Tanya Mosevich is probably one of the world's great designers, and a woman of incredible integrity and talent. I mean, her designs were impeccable in terms of the detail and the taste. Everything was always appropriate for the play.
I like that. A very specific memory on that. Specifically when Tyrone Guthrie left, and you were there, were you? Langham succeeded right around that time?
Yes.
How did the festival change? How did the baton change hands? Or what?
Oh boy. With Guthrie, it was very much Guthrie style, and that was pizzazz and an interpretation of Shakespeare that was unique and filled with theatricality. Brilliant director, Guthrie, and a brilliant mind. When Langham took over, it was very different in the sense that Langham spent a little, as I remember it, more time in exploring the texts of plays and more time exploring the actors and the plays. the personalities were so. Guthrie was a huge man, and would say, actors sweep across the stage, do this, do that. Langham worked much more intimately with each actor in the developing of the role.
Who was the Professional Repertory Theatre project? That's fine. That's a pre-Neptune thing.
I've no.
Yes, that's fine. I went to some of my accessory stuff I want to ask here. That's why I'll be jumping back and forth.
Okay.
Because I've covered the main thing. Young Neptune. Can you tell me a little about that? Do you have any connection with the Young Neptune company?
No, that was, I believe, Heiner Piller's invention. Have you talked to Heiner? Will you? Heiner Piller came as my associate in the 60s, and then he was the second artistic director of Neptune. And I think a very important one in the history of Neptune artistic directors, because he developed things. Do you want me to answer that? You want to? Very important in Neptune's history. And he lives in Toronto. But Heiner.
Is it okay?
Heiner became much more a part of the community than I did. He developed I think he would develop the Young Neptune touring. He developed all kinds of things that I didn't do, and he tried to carry on that whole. Heiner originally is from Austria, so he was brought up in the repertory tradition. So he, of course, approved of it, and he tried to keep it going. But you should talk to Heiner about the problems that he had with Neptune, because he inherited. When you're the founding artistic director, you can have it good, because anything you do, right? The second artistic director is always much more difficult, because the board now knows more, all right? Or they think they know more. And Heiner had to deal with that. So you should talk with Heiner, because he's an important figure in Neptune.
Well put. Stage managers, do any stick in your mind?
Well, Gary Leroy was the first stage manager of Neptune. He was then married to Deanne LeBlanc. And Deanne LeBlanc came into the company just out of the National Theatre School, as did Gary. And he was there a couple of years, very good stage manager. And then there were many that they get blurry now.
Did you, without naming names, were there any people you had to fire out of absolute frustration?
Oh no, I had to fire an actor once, and that was very painful. Firing people is not something that anybody does happily, and it was very hard. I've had to fire a couple of people at Neptune, and it was painful. I mean, the lack of sleep for weeks before and weeks after. So,
sometimes people look back on their criticism that they didn't like and see that was right. Was there any positive results from any fire?
Oh, do you want to stop?
Yeah, please.
Okay, where were we?
Okay, yes, were there any positive spin-offs from these firings or these conflicts where people might have got back to you and say, that was the best thing I done?
Oh yeah, in a couple of cases that is in fact what happened. And once I hired an actor for a part, and it was just the stupidest casting in the world, and I wasn't directing. The director and the actor, they came to the first rehearsals, and 3 days later it was clear it wasn't going to work. So I had to fire the actor. And in fact, it was the best thing I could have done. But it's a hard, to fire is hard.
What sort of life standard of living did actors have? What kind of digs could they be put up in? How hungry were they for the work? That kind of idea. Survival.
Oh, well, 1963, CBC was still doing lots of shows, so there was work here. The Crest was in existence. There was not a lot of theatre outside of that. Manitoba was working, and I think Vancouver was working, so there was some work. But what Neptune offered actors was a very decent salary. They most of the actors had nice homes they rented, decent accommodation. George Sperdakis, for example, had a wonderful house on Duncan's Cove, where he was a beautiful house on the ocean. So they all lived well. I mean, it wasn't luxurious, but I love luxurious today. So, but they lived well. There was enough money to bring up the family, and so I think the standard of living was quite good at the time.
Did many of you see each other?
2 minutes, sorry.
Great. Did you see each other much outside of the theatre, and where would you be likely to reconnoiter?
We would have dinners together on Sundays when the theatre was dark. Most often, those Sundays, people kept to themselves with their family. I remember one fabulous evening when the Moscow Art Circus came to Halifax. And we had the night off, and we all went to the circus and were overwhelmed by them. And we decided we would invite all the members of the Moscow Art Circus to Neptune Theatre for an evening after a performance. And after their performance and our performance, and we were playing Diary of the Scoundrel at the time, all the Moscow artists came to Neptune, and we had drinks and food, and they then put on a show for us on the stage, an impromptu show, and they showed off. And some of the our actors got really angry at them showing off. So they got on the stage and they did some of their scenes, and Mary Mcmurray said, "Damn it," and she got on the stage and sang. It was fabulous. And so we had this wonderful evening of camaraderie and show off. And it was an amusing evening because it was the Russians and the Canadians trying to outdo each other in, I think, a relatively hostile, friendly way.
And the tape, is it?
It's 1 minute.
1 minute left. I think they were just about through there. That was sort of for the Cold War period.
Yes, yeah.
Good story. And anything else?
No.
I think we've really covered a lot of that anyway. So let's cut Gill tape then.
Okay.
Yeah.